Welcome back to the Elite Performance Podcast. Today, our guest is Cameron Josse. Cameron is the Director of Sports Performance for Defranco Training Systems. Today, Cameron and I discuss how he uses the 1080 sprint to help his athletes get faster. So today's topic is basically all about speed, some of the common technical and mechanical defaults that he sees during acceleration and top-end speed, some of his favorite tools to change that. We also talk about how he uses the data from the 1080 sprint to help his athletes get faster, more powerful, both during acceleration and max velocity. So today is a wonderful episode. Cameron's a bright young guy, shared a lot today. I know I took a ton of notes from his conversation, and I know you will as well. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get to Cameron. Welcome back to the Elite Performance Podcast. Today, our guest is Cameron Josse. Cameron, how you doing today?
I'm great, man. Thanks for having me on. I'm a big fan of everything you've got going on, and I'm excited to be here. Thanks again.
Yeah, I appreciate that. So let's start off. Let's go. Give us a little background of how you got to where you are today.
So I am the Director of Sports Performance for Defranco's gym, and I kind of joke around with people because currently, as it stands, I am a staff of one. So I don't direct anybody except myself and the athletes that I work with. But we got a real small operation that we're currently running. I work in conjunction with Joe Defranco on just brainstorming ideas for the programs that we come up with and just the templates. And then ultimately I'm the one that ends up unraveling the programs with the athletes. But I guess to kind of give a brief review of how I ended up here was it all started, my whole journey with Defranco's started as a client. So when I was in high school, I went to look for some places to train, and so I ended up finding Defranco's gym, which was about 10 minutes down the highway from where I was living when I was in high school with my parents. And so went down there and saw some awesome results my first year there, and I just fell in love with the concept of training athletes and building them up. And before I went to college, I didn't really know what I was going to study or what I wanted to do. And then after my experience at Defranco's, I was like, I want to do something like this. I want to get into sports and coaching of some sort and helping athletes progress. So went to school. I studied kinesiology and exercise science. And then when I would come back in the summers to train, because I was also playing college football at University of Rhode Island. So when I would come back in the summers, I would train with Joe again. And then I asked him one day, I'm like, hey, do you mind if I just start shadowing you a little bit? Like just to kind of learn about how you work with guys that are outside of the group that I work out in. He's like, yeah, absolutely. You can just kind of hang out and, ask any questions you want. And so basically it kind of turned into like a mini internship where when I'd be home in the winters or in the summers, I would just shadow Joe and learn about what he was doing. And also the other coaches that were working with him at the time. And, got to really see a lot of hands-on work because, when you're in school, they don't really, they teach you stuff by the book, but they don't tell you. There's a lot of like impractical stuff in a way. Like it's not stuff that you're going to be able to immediately apply to athletic populations. And a lot of it's, health-driven, cardiac health or prevention of disease or whatever. So it was cool for me to see like a hands-on approach with athletes with what Joe was doing. So after I was done with college, he ended up basically offering me a job at, Defranco's gym, which was a dream come true because I didn't know what I was going to do. I was like, do I go in the college route? Do I try to become a GA? Do I try to find another private sector facility? I don't really know what I want to do. And so I called Joe and he's like, if you want, I'm thinking of bringing on somebody for a small role here if you want to be that guy. So I hopped on that opportunity and then I worked with him for about 2 years. And then he came to me with the opportunity to try to go down to Austin, Texas, where we were trying to do a co-branding experiment with the company On It Labs. And I was down there for 2 years just trying to see how the co-branding experiment would work. And ultimately, both sides sort of agreed that it was probably better if we start separating. And On It just they don't have to worry about having the Defranco's name with next to their name. And same thing with us. It's more about like, let's just build our own brands a little bit. And, there's no bad blood between us. We still keep in touch with those guys down at On It. But now we're basically back in New Jersey, a very small location in East Rutherford. Our weight room is pretty small, about 1,000 to 1,500 square feet. We take really small groups now. And that's kind of our goal, is we just wanted to say, hey, like, we have this opportunity now where we can keep things a little bit smaller, because the brand is sort of developed to where it is, where Joe has the ability to have his podcast. He's doing stuff online all the time. He's doing consulting. He's doing speaking engagements. So he's sort of built the brand up to be this living being that's sort of worldwide now. So what we wanted to do with the hands-on stuff was just do a smaller business model and keep quality really high. And just experiment, see what works and what doesn't, and just sort of share what we're doing, for anybody who's interested. And that's where we are right now. And it's been a cool journey.
Yeah. Joe's a legend in our field and quite the mentor for you to have, in person on a daily basis, to have him there. What does it mean to have a guy like that you can talk to whenever you want? I mean, that's like I said, a hell of a mentor to have.
Yeah, it's funny because I always looked at him as my coach, because he started off by training me. So I always looked up to him from that standpoint. But he's absolutely been, arguably the biggest role model in the field that I've had, because he's the one where I always say that people don't really know him. They can't judge him by what they think he might be like. He's bald, he's jacked, he looks like this big meathead, but he's absolutely one of the nicest people you'll ever meet. He's super generous. And he genuinely cares about, my growth working under him. Like, he cares about me learning more. And he's instilled just that undying drive into me from day one, where he's like, you can never get complacent with what you think you know. And it's cool because people look at him and they might say, oh, he's like a legend in the field. And, it's awesome that you get to work with him. But if you sit down and talk with him, he certainly doesn't act that way. Like, he doesn't take on that role at all. Like, he considers himself a student still to this day. Like, he still wants to learn. He still wants to grow. He asks me questions all the time. And I'm like, you're my coach, like, you're asking me questions. Like, you want me to try to lecture you on something? And so he put that value in me, and it's made me realize, when I was a young coach, I was like, I need to have this undying drive to continue learning more. And then now, as I get a little bit older and as I start approaching my 30s, I'm going to start, realizing that it goes both ways, where you have to start giving back to the younger coaches as well, and start, trying to instill that in them, because if you put that in them when they're younger, they can really start teaching you some stuff as they start to progress. And it's all just different viewpoints and different ideas that can all come together to create a collective, awesome whole. And, that's a value that he instilled in me from when I was his client, and then just on throughout this experience working with him. So yeah, definitely very fortunate that I stumbled upon Defranco's gym when I was in high school, for sure.
Yeah, that's a great story. Now, you say you're a little bit capped for space in terms of your weight room, but two things that are nice, like you said, you have a field right across the street, a full football field and track, and you also have access to a 1080 sprint, which is an incredible piece of equipment. So let's talk about we're going to talk about the 1080 sprint quite a bit, but before we delve into kind of how you use it and the insights that you gain from it, let's talk about some of the following definitions, okay, that the 1080 sprint gives you back from its readings. So real quick, the theoretical maximal running velocity, what does that mean from the 1080 sprint?
Basically, anytime you do a rep on the 1080 sprint, you are provided with real-time feedback of peak velocity and average velocity over the distance that you covered. So if you were to run, say, a 30-yard sprint against 2 kilos of resistance on the 1080 sprint, as soon as you're done, you can see, as soon as your rep is finished, all these different data points. They'll tell you the time it took you to cover the segment. So it times it automatically. It'll give you peak and average force, peak and average power, and then peak and average velocity. So in terms of the velocity, it's giving you basically the highest velocity you achieved at a certain point during that sprint completion, and then the average is just what your average velocity was over the entire distance that was being covered. And the great thing about the software associated with the 1080 sprint is that that's the information you get on the tablet right away. And then what you can actually do is go back later and use the 1080 web app, which allows you to go in further and look at only certain segments. So you could take, that 30-yard sprint that you did, and you would say, well, how fast was I from 10 to 15 yards? You could even say, how fast was I from 10 to 11 yards? Like, you could break it down to 1 yard or 1 meter. And then the data follows from that standpoint as well. And the web app is great because it can give you time to 90% of max velocity. Like, how long did it take you to get to your 90% of max velocity, which is important, for team sport athletes. Just, how can they accelerate to a very fast speed in a short amount of time and cover ground. And then they also tell you your acceleration pattern. They give you a visual representation of every stride. So you can see imbalances. You can see if there's a peak that's a little bit higher on your left leg and then it's lower on your right leg. Your right leg's not giving the same output that your left leg is. So if the guy is not injured yet, he might be on his way to being injured. So it's something that you can use to monitor injury as well. And they've recently actually installed a force velocity calculator that instantly provides you force velocity outputs as well. So basically you can sprint against however many loads you want. I think it has to be at least 3. So you can do 3 to 5 to 6 loads. And then it can basically give you like a 1 rep max, if you will. They call it like the M0. And that's basically like your 1 rep max for sprinting. And it's interesting because you can maybe track that for team sport athletes. And if they were to get hurt and you want to have them return to play, you want their M0 to be as close to where it was before, which is kind of cool. So there's a lot of cool data points that machine provides you.
Awesome. Let's talk about another data point, the RF, or the ratio of force. So what is that telling you?
So the ratio of force is basically describing, anytime you're sprinting, you have what's called the resultant force. And the resultant force is basically just quite literally the result of the combination between vertical and horizontal forces that are being put into the ground. So in the research, when they're talking about ratio of force, they're really talking about the proportion of your total force that's horizontal in nature. So that's an important data point when you're looking at acceleration, because you want to be able to expand your ability to produce horizontal force, because theoretically that can allow you to accelerate better, and you won't reach top speed too soon and burn yourself out. So it's an important quality specifically for sprinters. And then where it applies for team sport athletes is that when they're in these low positions and they need to explode out, I always think about like a defensive end in football and how he needs to get in that low stance and explode and get up the field. If he's coming out too vertically out of his stance, then that's an issue. So they have 2 specific data points that I've seen in the research as it relates to ratio of force. And the first one is the peak ratio of force, which is basically how horizontal is your force when you start the sprint. And then they have the ratio of force at 10 meters, which is, once you reach 10 meters, how horizontal are you still at that point? So I think people have a misconception with that, where they think that they need to like really try to force guys to be horizontal, and they have these weird positions where they're like hunched over and it's just bad technique. You don't really want to force it, because even at the ratio of force of 10 meters, a lot of the guys I've been looking at and testing that stuff with, they're all, 30 to 33% horizontal. So it's already like predominantly vertical by the time you get to 10 meters in terms of like the ratios. So, but then it'll be higher when you're coming out of your stance. So coming out of the stance, guys, team sport athletes I've worked with, they're usually between like 60 and 65% ratio of force when they start the sprint. But then by the time they're already at 10 meters, it's down to like 30, 33%. So I think people need to understand there are some vertical forces that are at play, because you're constantly rising with every step until you reach, upright mechanics. So, but yeah, that's basically what that data point means.
Yeah, sometimes the vertical versus horizontal, gravity is always acting upon us, so there's always going to be some sort of vertical force. So you talked about at the start, you're typically seeing about a 60 to 65% ratio of force. And then at 10 yards, that drops down to about 30, 35%. So you're looking for a smooth transition between each step. So second step, you're looking at like maybe a 50, 5 and then 4-step, whatever. So each step is decreasing at a constant ratio or constant decrease in percentage?
Well, yeah. So what they have is another data point that's called the DRF, and that's the decrease in the ratio of force. And what that is specifically referring to is how much force, how much horizontal force are you losing with every step as you gain. I think it's 1 meter per second. So every 1 meter per second faster that you get in the sprint, what's the percentage of horizontal force that you're losing? So if you look at elite sprinters, they're all losing less than 10%. So a lot of them are really around like 6% or 5%. So they only lose about 5 or 6% force, horizontal force, as they accelerate. So that allows them to spread it out further. With team sport athletes, you can expect that number to be higher just because their acceleration patterns are different. So, in a 100-meter dash, you have to spread your acceleration out strategically so that you don't reach top speed too early and you burn yourself out. So you want to spread it out as far as you can. But it might be a little bit different in a team sport. If you're a running back and you see a hole and you need to just gun it for 15 yards right now, you need to accelerate as much as you possibly can in 15 yards. So for team sport athletes, typically they'll be around 10%. That's what I've been finding, if they're pretty efficient. A lot of them are higher than that. I've had guys that are 14, 15% on their DRF. I've had some guys go as low as like 8% that are team sport athletes once they've learned some good techniques and some efficiency, but they won't be as low as elite sprinters, at least in my experience that I've seen.
Okay, perfect. Now that we have some background on that, so what are some ways that you use this information with the 1080 sprint and apply it to your athletes?
Well, basically you need to figure out when you're watching somebody sprint, like, we work with guys that are training for combines or pro days. And if we use like the 40-yard dash as an example, we need to figure out like where are they struggling to get better at their 40-yard dash? Is it just that they don't have the ability to twitch, like they just they can't move their limbs quickly, which is actually pretty uncommon in a lot of football players, is that a lot of them do have the ability to drive and push out, and they actually need to work a little bit more on moving their limbs faster and the faster, or basically getting used to being in that environment of high velocity running or max speed. And so, but what we can look at is there are still guys that, especially guys that have been predominantly doing, the quick foot ladder drills and stuff like that. Like those guys, Joe Defranco always says they go nowhere fast. So they're moving their limbs at 100 miles an hour and they're not getting anywhere in time and space. So it's funny because they'll still show up with like really bad velocity because they're just not going anywhere. So for those guys, if you look at, their ratio of force and the decrease in their ratio of force, the numbers are awful because they're not understanding how to propel themselves forward in acceleration and apply force into the ground efficiently. So that's where some of these numbers can come into play, is like, hey, like I said, the numbers before, those are the ranges that, guys should probably fall into, which shows that they're okay with their force output. If they're less than 60% when they're coming out of their start, then it's probably something they need to work on. They probably need to do some things that are going to improve their force when they come out of a sprint start. And then if their DRF is bad, the decrease in their ratio of force, a lot of times it is related to technique. And so that also carries over into max velocity running. There's a lot of guys that struggle they don't have great technique when they're sprinting. They're very sloppy. They overstride. They're doing weird stuff with their arms. So a lot of times these problems can be sort of helped by just focusing on technique, and you don't have to get too crazy or too creative. But the 1080 is cool because it provides you with that information. So you can, like I said, you can see their velocity and you can basically look at it and say, they're just not fast enough. They need to get faster. So we need to work with some lighter loads or just no load at all, or even assisted sprinting, which the 1080 can provide a very safe way to do overspeed, which is an incredible feature of it as well. But then on the flip side, some guys might be okay with, their ability to run fast, but they can't start well. Like their early acceleration is not great. And that's where you can say, okay, well, this force velocity profile on the 1080 will show that to us. And now we need to maybe improve their force a little bit when they're coming out in the early acceleration. So really like the loaded sprinting that you can do, because you can go pretty heavy on the 1080. That stuff is going to help your start. It's going to help your early acceleration. And then, I also think it's going to help with some specific situations you might see in the sport, like a running back running through a tackle or a lineman driving through somebody. It's building up those sort of specific strength qualities that go into those type of things, but it's not necessarily going to get somebody, crazy fast in their 40 time.
Yeah. Let's peel back a couple of those things you talked about. First, you talked about team sport athletes typically have poor or less than great mechanics and technique.
Yep.
So let's look at acceleration and then max velocity. Pick out the one or two most common areas or errors that you see during acceleration and max velocity, and then maybe some quick ways of how you address that in terms of trying to improve it.
Sure. Yeah. So I think a really cool piece of information that I read, and actually I talked to him about as well, was when I spoke with Ken Clark, and he made it apparent to me that the best sprinters stay front side dominant from the start all the way through the finish line when they're sprinting. I think there's like a lot of misconception about how to really train that, because I think a lot of coaches they're so worried about guys pushing back into the ground that they forget to tell them about like punching their knee forward, or whether or not you tell them about it, but put them in situations where they're going to learn how to do that. So that was something that I found with myself, before I talked to Ken Clark about it and saw some of his work, was a lot of these athletes were they get it in their head that they need to like force the lean, like it's kind of like what I was saying before, like they try to force themselves to stay low instead of just naturally working with what their current skill level is. So I always try to tell my guys, I'm like, hey, don't try to force anything. Just do what feels natural. If you start coming up a little bit early, that's fine for right now, because you're still learning. As you get better and more comfortable in these sprinting positions, you'll probably start just sort of naturally coming out a little bit lower. So I think that's a big time one. And definitely the upright running standpoint as it relates to max velocity, I think that's a big time issue with a lot of team sport athletes in general, is that they are just like, I don't know where they get it from. I think it's just strange logic that they have where they feel like they need to continue to lean forward when they should be more in a nice neutral posture type position, and really working on pushing like down into the ground with good knee lift and avoiding butt kicking, like excessive butt kicking where they're overarched and they kick out the back so much that their like heel is hitting their butt cheek like before their knees even coming forward. Like they're just so far on the backside of their body when there's so much coming out about top level sprinters and just efficient runners being more front side dominant. And so I think that's something that a lot of coaches probably they need to learn about it, like I did, because that was something that I learned pretty recently about the importance of that, because it helps with the guys that have some hamstring issues. Like one of my guys was running good times and I was watching him in real time and I wasn't filming him. And I was like, yeah, it looked pretty good. So he was fast guy. Like he's moving quickly and it's almost like it's too fast for you to really see. Like you got to film it in slow motion. So, but he's like, my hamstring's just really tight. And I was like, okay, well, don't do the rest of the reps. Like that was always what I would tell him. Like, all right, well, just take it easy. Don't do the rest. And then when I watched him on video, he was doing exactly what I just said. He's overarched. He's kicking out the back. I'm like, no wonder his hamstring hurts. So we started addressing that issue. And one of my favorite drills for doing that was something I basically came up with out of necessity, which I don't even have a name for it. I just call it a med ball knee punch run, which is basically you hold a med ball, or it doesn't have to be a med ball. It could just be any kind of ball or object. I just use like a light med ball, like 6 pounds. You hold it at your belly button. And then when you're sprinting, or you have them sprint holding the ball right there, and you tell them to try to punch their thigh to the med ball. So it's like try to touch your quad to the med ball as you're running. That's the only instruction you give them. And they basically sort of self-organize to where they're doing like this beautiful front side mechanic running. And I did that with this guy for probably about 4 weeks. Just anytime we did some sprint work, I just put that med ball on there. And then I took it away from him. I said, all right, now try to just sprint regularly. And all of a sudden it was just, he just figured it out. Like he understood like what was wrong before and how awkward that felt. And now he can't go back to what he used to do. And his hamstring, he's had no issues with his hamstring since he started doing that. So that's definitely a really important point in terms of that helps with acceleration and being able to punch the knee forward in acceleration. And then also it really carries over into top speed and just upright running in general, because a lot of college coaches or even NFL coaches or whoever in any sport, when they're doing these excessive running volumes for conditioning with their players and they're running upright the whole time and they're butt kicking while they're doing that and having hamstring problems, it's all related to the same thing. It's just about trying to find some efficiency in what you're doing.
Yeah, that's a really incredible change. A beautiful drill, like you talked about, self-organization, just a kind of an external cue there. Some of you talk to some coaches and the drawback they say is, you work on drills and then when they get into the chaotic or the stressful environment of sport, they revert back to their old mechanics. But like you said, it takes time and it takes something that, I think the best drills allow athletes, like you mentioned, to self-organize or for their own brains to figure it out rather than you trying to cue them or do these slow drills. So that's a beautiful drill you came up with.
Yeah.
Have you seen some improvements as well with his, now obviously mechanics, but how about his times as well?
Yeah. So that was what was cool, because when I was reading the research from JB Marin and Pierre Samazino and those guys, they actually have like a paper that specifically talks about that, like the technical determinants of sprint performance, or I forget the name of the paper, but basically they say like if you can just improve technique, your times will improve, because you're running more efficiently now. And it was funny because we did a lot of focus with him on just doing technique work. Like we weren't really doing like full out high velocity sprinting in the upright motion. We were doing things like the med ball knee punch drill. We were doing A skips and running A's for distance, like 30 to 40 yards a pop. We were doing build up runs. We were doing like intensive tempos, like trying to stay more around like 80% and but not running full speed, just working on the knee punch and springing off the ground with each step. So we did a lot of technique drills with him. And when I retested his velocity, it was higher. So it was probably about, I think it was like 0.4 or 0.5 meters per second higher. And it was just from technique, because now I think what it was is he had that in him the whole time. He just wasn't in the right environment to express his underlying velocity capabilities. So I think we just sort of let that emerge by just kind of removing the physical constraints of him just doing something inefficiently, making it a little bit cleaner. And now all of a sudden he was able to run, I think, with the same potential he always had. He just was unable to realize it because he didn't have the right efficiency.
Yeah. I mean, you talk about speed, there needs to be a mechanical and technical proficiency in order to maximize your velocity. And I remember listening to Stu McMillan from Alta speak, and he's talked about with Andre DeGrasse leading up to last year's Olympics that they did basically no max velocity sprinting. It was all rhythm and feel and technical work because he was coming off a really big college season. But he said all of our work was just getting him to feel rhythm and posture and projection from acceleration to max velocity. And he said, you don't need to run full speed in order, like you mentioned, to get faster. If you can improve the mechanics even 1-2%, that's not only going to make him faster, but the most important thing you notice is he doesn't have any hamstring issues anymore. He doesn't feel that tightness anymore.
Yeah, he feels more comfortable when he's moving now. So I think that's really what it comes down to, is a lot of these higher level athletes is that, they have all the underlying physical capabilities. So you need to put them in positions where they feel good when they move. They shouldn't feel bad. They shouldn't feel strain. They should feel comfortable. They should feel rhythmic, like you said. So, I think a lot of it is just risk to reward ratio and just trying to figure out, how can we help keep them healthy? And that's really what it comes down to.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, you talked about it a little bit earlier, but have you played around much with the overspeed or assisted portion of the 1080 sprint?
Most of the work I've done with it has been on myself, just experimenting, because I need to learn more about it before I start using it with my athletes. But the nice thing with the 1080 is that you can basically control how much it's pulling you. So you have on the machine, if you're doing like resisted sprints, you can tweak the resistance setting, which makes sense. But then what you can do is you can flip around and basically like walk out to where the cable is already slacked. and then you can set it to where you actually tweak your assisted, just weight. So it's like how much it's pulling you back towards the machine. So the cool thing with that is because it's able to provide you with a snapshot of your velocity in real time, over whatever distance you program it to read, then you can actually determine a very specific percentage of your max velocity. So, if you know your max velocity is 9 meters per second, like 9.0 meters per second, you can find the setting on there that puts you at, say, 9.1 meters per second or something like that, so you can just very slowly like work it up that way, and find where it's still comfortable enough, but you are actually at super maximal intensities now. So that's what a lot of guys that have been using the Overspeed feature, like Chris Corfus, he's got a 1080 sprint, and that's what he does is he just sets it to where he's just tweaking the assistant setting on there, how much it's pulling them back towards the machine. Then he's monitoring what their velocity output is, and he's kind of going that way. It's funny talking to him. Like I've only just sort of used it a little bit on myself just to get a feel for it, and it is very smooth. It's not like the traditional where you feel like it's pulling you into the ground or anything like that. That's not really going on as much. It's a very smooth assistance where you feel like you're flying in like an awesome way. But what he does is he uses it with his track guys, and he told me that sometimes the first time he tried to do a decent amount of volume with it, his guys actually ended up like throwing up because he gave them full rest and everything, but he thinks it was because they've never been in like as neurologically taxing of an environment before. Their body had no idea what to do with it. So I think that's when he was like, okay, well, that might have been too much. We need to dial it back now. So yeah, it's pretty interesting, all the Overspeed stuff, because it's kind of foreign, there's not like a ton of research behind it. So I think that's why I'm still being cautious with it, and I want to learn more about it before I use it with the clients.
Yeah, that topic, I think, from my opinion, I think that might be a forefront of sprint improvement here in the future, given people are qualified to do it. But to see, what percentage or what, like I said, 9 meters per second, is it 9.1, 9.2? But I think that might be a new forefront in terms of opening up some really opening sprint realization in terms of speed. So I can't wait to see what you do with it, because I know you'll do some great work with it and get your feedback on it. Because right now, I mean, the 1080 sprint's the only thing that I know of that really gives that smooth assistance, and that you can dial in exactly what the speed is. I don't know any of our tools, whether you're pulling with bands, that can be dangerous, how much tension you put on it, or the old Overspeed, cable pulls that we used to do in high school track. I mean, that shit was hit or miss with how much you're getting pulled. So I think that's a really neat tool, and I'm interested to see what the research in the future holds when they look at the 1080 sprint and assistance.
Yeah, me too. I think it's a whole nother area that just opens up so many doors from just a speed standpoint. So, I don't know enough about it to really comment too much on it. I need to learn more about it myself.
Yeah, I just wish the 1080 wasn't like $20,000.
It's slowly going down, it seems like, now as they start selling more.
Yeah, over the past year, I think it's gone from like 22 to 18. So, but still quite a hefty price. But awesome. Last question here with the 1080 sprint. You've delved into it quite a bit, but talk about force velocity profiling with your athletes. Are you doing with all your athletes the force velocity profile on their sprint with the 1080 sprint, and how are you using this information?
Well, really, what I want to find now is I actually just had a really cool conversation with Ken Clark, and he just wrote a paper that basically, for the first time, I haven't seen anybody else do this. The first time where he's actually looking at velocity outputs, acceleration patterns, and just all of the physics that go into the NFL Combine 40-yard dash. And he's got a paper coming out. I want to say it's Journal of Strength and Conditioning that's coming out pretty soon, but he shared some of the information with me where he analyzed the modeled velocity of these guys when they're doing their 40-yard sprints. And he has the math where he can actually calculate, ranges that specifically from that 2016 Combine in his paper, but he could probably do it with anybody at this point. As long as he has the numbers there, where he can show you what the modeled velocity would be for these guys. So if, people understand what their 40 time should probably be around if they expect to be a first round draft pick. But one of the things that I'm currently trying to finish up an article for right now is arguing that we shouldn't really look at split times as much, but more at actual velocity, because that's going to allow us to really know how fast this person can move in time and space. Because, you might have a guy who might kind of stumble out of his sprint stance or something, and then he tries to make up for it in the rest of the race, and he might not run a great split time. But if you take his 30 to 40 yard segment, his velocity is like off the charts because he was trying to make up for it. So he might not run a great time versus another guy, but his velocity might be higher. So ultimately he is faster. It's just that there's a skill component to the 40 yard dash. So I like looking at velocity because that's more of that raw speed. Like, what are they actually able to do? So with that research in mind, he can now put numbers to this stuff, like by position, like what some of the top guys at every position can reach from a velocity standpoint. So what I'm doing with sprinting now is really just saying to myself, what these guys that want to be pros, or if they are pros, is, are they even fast enough where they're like, at least in the middle of the pack to the faster guys? I don't want them to be the slowest, because he's modeled that for me as well, where he showed me the slowest guys. We definitely don't want them there. We want them at least average, and then definitely put them above average if we can. And so what I'm doing with this stuff now is like, are they even able to reach these certain velocities? Because if they're not, then they're just not fast enough. So we need to figure out how to get them faster. So before I start getting too cute and crazy with all the different methods you can apply to increase their sprint force or this or that or whatever, is, well, I should say step one is, what's their technique look like? And then B, once their technique is okay, how fast are they actually running? Because if you take a college kid who's, really slow, and but he loves the weight room, he's like a strong kid or whatever, but he's just slow, he probably shouldn't be doing like heavy resisted sled sprints and stuff like that. He should probably focus on unloaded sprint work and just trying to get faster. So that's where my head's at now, is really just, if you look at some of his research, is the effect that if you're just faster, like how that also affects your entire acceleration profile. So that's something that's really important, because the heavy resisted work and the short sprint work, that's working like your start, but it's not really helping you too much as you spread the sprint out. Like JB Marin and those guys will tell you the same thing. Like, they're like, yeah, it's a specific tool for a specific purpose, but ultimately guys just need to be fast. And it's interesting when you look at Ken Clark's stuff and how it's kind of like if you have a 400-pound bencher versus a 200-pound bencher, the 400-pound bencher's 90% is way higher than the 200-pound bencher. So it's the same thing with speed. So it's like, if he's reaching like 90% of his max speed by the time he's at 15 yards, well, he's still way faster at that segment point than the guy that's slower than he is. So, they might accelerate the same way, but this guy's just faster. So that's how it affects your acceleration profile. And it's basically like, you need to figure out what's important now with these guys. And so that's sort of how I'm looking at it, where basically I'm thinking speed first now with sprint work. And then I'm trying to figure out like where we can get specific going from there. Like, first step is just, we need to get them faster. Like, they're just not fast enough. Or if they are fast enough, how can we just improve certain elements? Maybe their start sucks, so now we do some resisted work so they can launch out of a cannon better, and then they can realize their speed as they go. So there's a lot of different ways you can look at it.
Yeah, the fuller the glass, the fuller everything else. I mean, I had this conversation with conditioning. You see a lot of team sports put a big emphasis on conditioning rather than actual speed. Now, it's like that speed reserve. If you get an athlete faster, in a sense, their conditioning will be better because they have a higher speed reserve. So even if they drop off more, they're still going to win because they have a higher max velocity or higher max acceleration. So, I mean, we waste time on conditioning to be able to run a 5 flat 40 10 times in a row, rather than getting people down to a 4.8 40. And even if they can only run it, they drop off a lot each rep, they're still going to win, beat that 5.0 40 guy every freaking time because he's faster.
Yeah, it's funny. You can you can have all the endurance in the world and attempt to chase down the fast guy on every on every play, like you're 100%, but if he's just faster, you're never going to catch him, So
Yeah.
it comes down to that.
Yeah. I mean, Ken Clark's a bright man. He's an awesome dude. And he's just a great of, transferring the science and research into a practical application. So, and a former football player, so always good in that sense.
Yeah, he's super helpful, super nice, and totally practical about everything he researches, which is great.
Yeah. Perfect. Let's shift gears a little bit here to some more like movement or agility for football, okay? So with, such tests as the 5-10-5 or the algebra kind of dominating the evaluation process for football, how do you see these tests, falling short of evaluating and preparing athletes for the actual demands of their sport?
Well, yeah, it comes down to the fact that I want to say it was Lauren Landau I heard talk about the 5-10-5 and the 3-cone, where he described them as like a dance, like sort of just a choreography. And he's 100% right. Like you just learn the steps and you've beaten the drill, So what they're assessing is basically somebody's ability to choreograph their own steps. Like you're not even fully doing a closed change of direction drill really, because they're just, it's all just a choreographed, pre-structured drill that they're doing. So, I guess I understand like their simplistic intentions of putting those drills in there, but sports are they're so much more complex than something like that could ever show you. Because, if you're trying to change direction on a field, it's funny. I tell the guys that are like obsessed with ladders and stuff, where they're like, oh, you gotta be able to have like quick feet and move, you gotta go side to side. I'm like, well, like think about what you're trying to say, because if you throw a football to a receiver on a field in the middle of a game and he turns around and nobody's there, there's just the end zone. He's going to sprint to the end zone in a straight line. He's not going to cut unless there's somebody in his way, or if he has to redirect to get around opponents or whatever. So right away, that already tells you that the intention behind why people change direction has to be understood. Like the context needs to be there, because if there's no reason for them to change direction, they're not going to. They're just going to get to the end zone because they know ultimately the intention is to score. And the same thing goes for if you're on defense. If your guy catches the ball and he's right in front of you, he doesn't see you, you're just going to run straight at him and tackle him. So I think it comes down to like, what are these drills really doing? Like, what are we trying to improve? So is it good to just take a bunch of closed drills and work these maneuvers because they're going to be found on the field? Or should we focus the drill structure more on what's the intention of why you're doing these drills? Like what's the intent behind, like, what's the task, like, what are you trying to do here? So I was talking with Sean Mishka about it, who's obviously like, he's immersed in all this stuff. It's what he preaches all the time. But it's like, if you read like Ian Jeffrey's game speed manual, yep, he'll give a target movement and then he'll also give a target context. So it's like, if I'm going to start to the side, I do a hip turn to start to the side, right? So I start facing one way, I turn my hips and I run the other way. So he calls that a hip turn. So if you're teaching an athlete, do you want to tell them today we're going to work on a hip turn? Or do you want to say like, hey, today we're going to work starting to the side? Because now they have the context, and then they have to figure out sort of what that means. Is so like, instead of telling them you want to do a hip turn, bend your knees like this, turn your hips like this, take this angle, is it better to just say like, hey, I want you to start to the side and try to get to this point and as fast as you can, or whatever, whatever the drill is. So he and I were kind of brainstorming about that, is about like, you need to understand like why somebody's going to change direction on the field. And I think that's what's great about Ian Jeffrey's book, is that he does give you the movement, but he gives you the context as well. So if you want to move backwards while also reading something that's going on in front of you, what are you going to do? Well, you're probably going to backpedal, So, you explain to them that that's the context of the motion, not just focusing specifically on, I need to work on my backpedal. If you're on the field and you read something where you don't have to backpedal, then, if you see something now, you need to react and sprint. You know what I mean? Like, it's just understand the underlying context of what you're doing. So I think that's going to end up being where the field needs to shift, and where we need to start understanding like the purpose behind movements instead of just the movements themselves.
Yeah, I mean, you're spot on 100%. Like you said, I think coaches are well-intentioned, trying to mimic or duplicate movements they see in the field. But when you take it outside the specific context of those movements in sport, it's never going to transfer. I mean, and that's what, my big pet peeve too is, what you see in the field or in a game, that motor response or that technique displayed, it all depends on when, where, what, and how that athlete responds to a particular stimulus. So, and if that's not appreciated, then those drills, those change of direction or closed circuit drills will never transfer. And so I think you're, spot on with that. So what are some ways that you try to bridge that gap in terms of these close change direction technique stuff into the actual open agility that will transfer the sport?
So what I played with around this summer was we would start with closed work just to try to get them to understand what these motions feel like, and just try to get them to understand like basic concepts behind changing direction. Like, if you're going to try to make a cut move, you probably want to lower your center of mass. You probably want to step a little bit wider so your base of support changes, so it allows you to redirect in an efficient manner. So we worked on some stuff like that. Going forward, I need to like reevaluate and figure out, how necessary really doing that is. But in my head, I was like, well, they just need to get comfortable maybe with some of the motions here. But I did try to tell them, I did try to still let them explore a little bit. Like I would sort of give them like a pattern combination and just say like, start going forward, then redirect going backwards, and then redirect back to the right or something like that. Like that's all I would say, instead of like, sprint forward, drop step, hip turn, like naming all these movements. It was more about like I would give them a combination of intentions and just sort of see how they do it. And I would be patient with them too, and just let them sort of get comfortable moving in different directions. And so we started with some closed drills like that, and then we just sort of progressed to like very basic reactive type drills, which were basically at the fundamental core just variations of playing tag. It's just, there's always one guy who's going to set the tone, the other one has to match the tone, so he's got to sort of figure out what that guy's doing. And that's what we progressed towards, was just really basic things. It might be like, we have two boxes and they both kind of meet in the middle, and then one is just going to go to one corner, the other one has to follow him, he's going to redirect. I'd say, all right, you guys have 3 direction changes. If we call them cat and mouse. So if you're the mouse and the cat has to catch you, the mouse gets to do 3 direction changes, the cat has to try to keep up with him, basically. So we would do stuff like that. And then going forward even further, I started just incorporating aspects, specifically with like our NFL guys, just aspects of the sport, and like how it's still a variation of tag, but now it's getting a little bit more contextual to what they're going to do on the game. So like a big challenge for a receiver per se is to face the quarterback, catch a ball, and then turn around and try to find where the defender is and see if he can get any more yards after catch. So we might do a drill where I have a defender who can see what's going on the whole time, and then the guy who's on offense is blind. He doesn't know what's going on behind him, and I throw him a ball. I threw a football at him, but you could use whatever you want. You could throw a basketball at him or a beach ball, and then he would catch the ball, turn around, try to locate the defender, and then try to get around him without being tagged within a certain boundary that was preset. And so what we would do is I would have the defender, I told the defender, I said, you need to change your starting position each time, because that's going to be some work for him trying to come at different angles. But then it's also going to require the guy on offense to turn around, locate him, and then perceive what he needs to do. So if the guy's not anywhere near him, he can just sprint to the finish line, like I talked about before. If the guy's right in his face, he's got to find a solution right now. And like, me as the coach, am I going to tell him what to do? Not really. He's just got to figure it out. He's in all that chaos right now. So that's like a brief example of what we did. And from there, you can just kind of, get creative and figure out just what works with certain contexts and what you're allowed to do. You can't use footballs in the off season in college settings and stuff, but that's why I said you could use a beach ball. You can use really whatever you want. It's really just getting players to understand the intention of what they're doing, like how to locate, how to perceive, how to react to it, and then like what movement solutions fit those certain environments, So, and a lot of times they start whipping out these motions that you definitely never taught them. It's a necessity, like to survive the drill, basically. It's pretty cool. So they start just sort of having these things come together, and they just formulate these coordinative structures that just seemingly come out of nowhere. And it's really cool to see as the coach where you just kind of let them just play around a little bit. And the players love it. They absolutely love doing that stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, some of the best performers are the most creative, and they are able to solve that movement problem that's on the field most optimally and creative. I mean, you talk about Michael Jordan going the rim and he's doing all this crazy stuff. You think you're ever practicing that stuff? Absolutely not. I mean, we have to allow our athletes to be creative. And I mean, research indicates that the perceptual cognitive ability is trainable and athletes can improve it. And if we just keep doing closed drills, we're creating robotic, uncreative athletes rather than fluid, guys that would have a, imagination and they're able to experiment with different things. I think in our training, we can do that and it will translate to the field. So,
yeah, 100%.
Tag's an awesome game. If you just constrain the task and the environment of certain tag games, I mean, you're winning right there. That's a great drill for all coaches.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Even though it seems childish, but it's awesome.
I mean, everybody likes when they were kids, right? They like playing as kids. And so even if you have a 30-year-old NFL vet, you can you still have them, do these childish seeming games, but they like it. It's fun. They understand the transfer.
Perfect. Let's wrap it up here, Cam. Let me give you our last 3 questions here. So first, give me your top 3 books that you would recommend to other coaches.
Definitely Game Speed, which I mentioned before, by Ian Jeffries. That's one that I've just gotten a lot of information out of that. I would definitely have to say Brett Bartholomew's book is another important one, I think, where it might not seem super important on the surface, but the more you dive into it, you realize how important the psychology behind players and how to coach and handle the different psychologies and temperaments you might come across with players. I think his book, Conscious Coaching, is a great one from that standpoint, like being able to label guys with certain archetypes and understanding the backgrounds of players that have different societal backgrounds than you do, so that's something that I think is important for coaches to read, interpret, and fully understand how to communicate their programs. Because ultimately, if you have the best program in the world, it doesn't matter if the athlete doesn't buy into it. And if you can't communicate it to the athlete, you're not a good coach, ultimately that's what it comes down to. And the last one is one that I just got, which is Game Changer by Fergus Connolly. And I definitely saved the best for last. I mean, this is I would go so far as to say probably the best sports preparation book I've ever read. I mean, it's fantastic how he breaks down team sports into such an awesome blueprint and gives you actionable ideas on what to do. And he sort of helps thwart a lot of the snake oil that's out there where some of these tech companies are trying too hard to persuade you one way versus the other. And he keeps it real. We'll put it that way. I haven't even finished reading it yet, but it's already like a jaw-dropping book. And, even when we get off this podcast, I'm going to dive back into it. So that's definitely, I would say those are 3 that are really important at this stage in the game.
Yeah, I put my order in for that one yesterday, so looking forward to that one.
It's fantastic. You're going to love it. It's great.
And something, you talked about some of these tech companies, and you mentioned Sean Mishka, and we talked, once and about kind of these agility lights where the lights are flashing. And I don't remember the last time I was watching a game and athletes were reacting to a flashing light in their sport, and that what dictated their movement. So some of that snake oil that coaches get tricked into, that's one of them that comes to my mind, flashing lights. And that's not mimicking any kind of sort of optimal agility movement in sport.
Yeah, what's the context? When you're reacting, are you reacting to a person? You're reacting to a light. Obviously, it's a person, and that's where the Game Changer book is great. He talks exactly about things like that. So I told Sean he's got to buy that book too. He's gonna love it.
All right, so let's say you have dinner with any 3 people, dead or alive. Who you bring to dinner with you?
Yeah, this is a great question, and one that I've gotten before, so I'm prepped for it. Yeah. But I want to say definitely the first one is Isaac Newton, just because I'm so amazed that a guy was able to come up with these laws of physics that have stood the test of time and just have reshaped so many fields of science. It's just unbelievable. It's just, can you sit in a room and talk with this guy and just, just understand how his brain works? It's something that's just incredible to me that he was able to do everything he could, especially in the time that he did it. I would say along the same lines is I'd like to have dinner with Leonardo da Vinci. That's another one where I just love to know how his brain works and how, just these types of savant type people, like just the stuff that they're able to figure out in the time that they do it. It's unbelievable the way they can do that. And I want to say thirdly, I'm going to change what I've said in the past just because of how much I'm hyping it up, but I want to have dinner with Fergus Connolly and pick his brain. Like, I want to know, I want to understand all the stuff he's been doing throughout his career and what he's doing now at Michigan. I want to figure that out in more detail. So I'd like to have dinner with Fergus Connolly. So if he's listening, let's see what we can set up. I'll come out to Michigan,
Yeah. I'd love to join you and be a fly on that wall in that conversation. Lastly, Cam, where can our listeners find you on social media? Where can they find more about you?
I'm pretty active on Twitter and Instagram, and I basically treat it as an online journal. I just sort of post what I'm doing. If people see it, great. If they don't, it's no big deal. It's more about just, I like to have this online journal of what I'm doing and a lot of videos to go with a lot of the stuff I talk about. So my Twitter and Instagram, the name is the same. It's just at Cam Josse, so at CamJosse. So you can find me on there. On Facebook, I'm not as active, but I'm Cameron Josse on Facebook. And I'm, just working on some stuff with Joe Defranco. He got an ebook coming out. You might find me in some Defranco stuff, but definitely on my social media is a good place to find me.
Well, Cam, man, this has been great. I really appreciate the openness in this conversation. I know I took away a lot. I got a page of notes here, but I really appreciate you taking the time today and sharing such great information.
Yeah, thank you, man. Thanks for having me on, and it's been awesome. Appreciate it.
Yep, thanks, Cam. Join me in thanking Cameron for today's wonderful episode. Wow, that was a great talk with Cameron. He shared a lot of information, in-depth information about how he uses his 10A sprint and how he goes about getting his athletes faster and some of those goals that he gets with his team sport athletes. So please, we'd be very appreciated if you're on the social media of your choice. Go ahead and give Cameron a shout out and thank him for his time today on the podcast and sharing such great, valuable information for our field. And we'll see you guys next time on the Elite Performance Podcast.